6 stretches are confirmed, ma'am. A Miat ensign called out into the communication network of the Mindahaji, watching the ship's sensors as it hovered within the space of the core world Geralitan. Estimated time of arrival about 20 uniform minutes. As she listened to the officer, Commander Girinora chewed on the joints of one of her long fingers with her incisors, feeling how her tough yet loose skin glided along the flesh and bone underneath the pressure of her own teeth. Her almost copper-coloured eyes were fixated onto the readings of the sensors she had on one of her own screens. "We don't have permission to engage should they turn out hostile," she then announced, after taking her finger out of her mouth to do so in an authoritative tone. Still, she didn't like this at all. "However, get some of our hunters ready, just to be safe, and start on establishing a grid." "Their humans have already done that, ma'am," another ensign replied to her command, to Gianora's surprise. A three-dimensional layout of the local space with flight paths and orbits of all of its celestial bodies and debris appeared on a different screen of hers. Then, a moment later, the mentioned grid appeared within the established map, dividing it into even and easily marked and differentiated cubes that all had a unique designation. "We'll upload it into our ships and tell our pilots to be at the ready." Girinora could only nod to herself. Humans work fast. "Remind them to familiarize themselves with the grid," she then ordered, even though the reminder would hardly be necessary. Still, it was always better to say it one time too often than one too little. In the boundless three-dimensional space of the void, where there was no up or down, it was hard for pilots to orient themselves. Establishing a grid helped a lot with that. However, that still wasn't even worth half as much if the first time the pilots actually saw the grid was only once they were already behind the damn steering. She released a laboured breath through her nose as she once again looked at the readings. For an invasion, this was certainly quite clumsy. Using a hyperspace of this length to approach was basically begging for trouble, since they could already detect it this long before their supposed opposition even arrived. A surprise attack was certainly out of the question. So what was the angle here? "Anything else our action-happy allies would like us to know?" she then asked over the line again, just to make sure she hadn't missed any other developments that the higher-class Deathworlders were already putting into motion. "No, ma'am," the ensign replied, with a tone that gave Gianora some pause, causing her ears to turn a bit more in the direction of her speakers as he continued. "Communication is a bit choppy at the moment. Seems like they have lost contact with their people on the ground." Gianora's eyes widened even more as one of them twitched for a moment. An attack on two fronts? Maybe the hyperspace was just a distraction. The humans' admiral was down there, wasn't she? "Are they requesting aid?" she wondered, as her finger rose to her mouth again. "Negative," the ensign replied relatively quickly, though his tone still suggested that he didn't quite know if he was happy with the information he provided. "They say they have it handled. Their suggestion to us is to focus on our own protection in case the arriving ships turn out to be hostiles." Girinora scoffed. Suggestion. Very funny. Not like she wasn't supposed to take orders from the Admiral and Vice Admiral in her current position. Sure, officially she was accompanying them into this system as an ally, and not under their direct command. But she wasn't an idiot. She knew there was a damn good reason that someone higher ranking than her hadn't been sent along on this trip. "Very well. If they don't want our help, we're not going to force it on them," she said with a dismissive sigh. Probably better that way anyway. She didn't have to waste her resources or her people. "In that case, keep a distance from whatever is arriving, and make sure the pilots are ready again." "Yes, ma'am," the ensign replied. And after that, there was little more they could do but to wait and keep a close eye on their sensors. The 20 minutes of estimated arrival time sure dragged on a lot, as they weren't able to do anything. It didn't help that their allies weren't being very talkative at the time, barely communicating outside of important information and their own movements. But ultimately, time did move linearly, and what was in motion would eventually arrive. They couldn't see the arriving ships yet, of course. On any visual sensors, the only thing visible was still the brightly shining ends of the hyperspace stretches that protruded into the system, glimmering in colors that one would not see during any other phenomenon. However, based on their distance, what they could see was currently still around 8 minutes in the past, as the light reflecting off the now-arrived ships would have to travel a bit before it would reach their eyes and cameras. But luckily, they had sensors that were a bit faster than visuals. "Dispersal of the hyperspace stretches confirmed, ma'am," her ensign informed her about what she could already see on the sensors herself. A wave went through the fabric of space, as the stretches instantly snapped back into their proper, original length, whilst the generators keeping them stable had been deactivated. And just like the stretch itself, those ripples moved far faster than light. Of course, nothing within the universe could move faster than light. However, that rule didn't apply to the universe itself, or even parts of it. After all, technically they weren't in the universe. "Make sure to be ready to pin down the next stretch," Gianora ordered, as she sat up a bit straighter in her commander's seat. Whatever those ships wanted, they couldn't achieve it from this sort of distance. They would have to come closer if they wanted to do anything but talk, and she doubted they were only here to talk. Then, she glanced over at another one of her screens, situated on the left side of her, slightly above her eye level. The screen still showed the established grid, as well as the positions of every ship they could currently pin down within it. The UHSDF cruisers Civil and Of the Roses were around the size of her own, Min-Hitaji, and had also kept their distance. The human's enormous flagship, A Place in the Sun, stuck a bit closer to the emerging stretches. It was a wild thought to have, but given everything she had learned about human weaponry ever since their alliance had emerged some months ago, Gianora almost suspected that the still quite unfathomable distance that the Atrocity class kept from the arrival of their enemies may just have been its own effective firing range. Most weapons were useless across distances like this, that took even light itself minutes to travel, of course. However, the same wasn't necessarily true for the heat that the UHSDF was packing. Still, even the sun wasn't exactly forming the front line here. No, that was formed by a long row of Khoivari ships that made up a good part of the local defences for this system. Gianora counted a total of 20 ships of many different sizes, but of very similar design. As all Habitat-style ships, they were tube-shaped and had very little in terms of decorations on the outside. Still, their bright white colour differentiated them quite firmly from the basically true, black, barely visible silhouettes of the human ships. The largest ones were 3 battleships, about half the size of the Sun. The next biggest were 5 destroyers, that were about a third bigger than the cruisers she was commanding. The Khoivari also had cruisers, 10 of them, all slightly smaller than her Min-Hitaji. The last 2 appeared to be some sort of support ships. If she was honest, Gianora didn't quite know what to make of them, since she wasn't familiar with the models at all. That kind certainly wasn't widely used among even the communal military. A Khoivari flagship was not among the defending ships, which was odd considering they were so close to their homeworld. However, every species handled that sort of thing differently. There was most likely a flagship around somewhere. That was, however, not getting involved, since the supposed attackers that were arriving there were already so wildly outnumbered here. "Travel-size hyperspace generation detected," an ensign suddenly called out, interrupting her thoughts. So they were indeed getting closer. Gianora scowled a bit. She had already seen the signals of the much thinner and smaller stretches that were sent up by the Khoivari in an attempt at communication earlier. It seemed like negotiations had probably failed, considering they had not gotten any sort of crisis averted from their supposed allies. Of course, across a distance like this, hyperspace travel may as well have been instant in many cases, meaning they only had a few seconds or less to pin down where the ships would jump to once the generators were fired up. Though as Gianora's tension built while she awaited whether they would lock onto the position in time, her eyes widened slightly and her teeth bit down onto her fingers to the point that it was almost painful, as a ping suddenly appeared on the grid she shared with her allies. That had barely been a second, and the humans already had the location? How? As she took a moment to silently wonder, her ship had already reacted to jump away from the expected point of arrival, while the Khoivari forces did the exact opposite, and turned their dangerous sides towards the emerging stretches that briefly outshone the local star for a moment as they emerged not far from their current position. Jurinora's eyes narrowed as she watched things unfold. 6 ships jumping this deeply into a defensive formation? Were they suicidal? "Get us more distance, I don't like this," she ordered with a grimace. High-class Deathworlders were of course known to be a bit paranoid at times, especially the ones coming from planets with hyper-competitive evolution. But still, her instincts told her something bad was lurking in the bushes here, and she'd rather not become some feral hog's next meal today. "Yes, ma'am," the lieutenant handling the ship's course confirmed. "What about the humans?" she then wondered, directing the question at a different officer. "Still holding their position, ma'am," the ensign from earlier informed her directly. "Should I suggest they move as well?" Chirinora thought for a moment, but then slowly shook her head to herself. "They know their tactics better than we do," she said, feeling pretty confident that people from a Class 4 world, primates or not, would be able to recognize when something stank. "Focus on our own safety until they request our assistance." "Understood, ma'am," the ensign confirmed. With her eyes focused onto the screen showing the visual of the hyperspace stretches, she caught just a glimpse of the ships emerging from them, before all sensors went completely dark for a moment, as the hyperspace of her own ship clouded them in complete darkness, by all possible definitions of the word. As brightly as the phenomenon shone whenever you watched it from the outside, that spectacle of light didn't even come close to comparing to the complete and utter deprivation of everything that you found inside of it. Sometimes, the void of space was called empty, but the true meaning of that word only became clear to those who had seen hyperspace from the inside. Miat didn't get void sickness like so many other species when they looked upon the vacuum of space while moving within its clutches, and yet, even someone as experienced as Commander Jurionora had to admit that her stomach did always start to tremble at least a little bit whenever she saw all of her sensors go dark, as the space outside of her windows turned into a flat sheet of complete blackness that may as well have been the true black paint her ally ships were coated in. Currently, their current repositioning was only relatively short. Not that Jurionora actually had any fear of hyperspace, but she sure as hell didn't want to spend any more time in there than she absolutely had to. Breaking back out into normal space-time as the stretch dissolved, all sensors immediately sprung back into action, and the first thing Jurinora's eyes darted towards was the established grid that now quickly updated itself to everything that had occurred while it was temporarily blind. The brief blink had been enough for the Quavery ships to completely surround the new arrivals in a threatening sphere formation, while their human allies had made just enough room to not be in the way of that. The opposing sides were now close enough to each other to switch to regular frequencies for communication, instead of needing to rely on hyperspace, meaning Jurionora could only guess if any sort of exchange was happening between the factions here, which really irked her. Couldn't the damn tree people at least keep them in the loop about stuff? Oh well, no use in getting angry over it to herself now. A bit later, visuals started to reach them as well. Although things were still reaching them with a relative delay at this distance, the Mintihaji was still close enough to the events that were unfolding to at least see what was going on in a reasonable amount of time. Jurionora had a stern look on her face as she watched the sphere of Quavery ships hover around the intruders in a restrained manner. Surely their weapons were primed to take out the opposition's hyperspace generators the moment the uninvited guests would attempt to jump again. They had well and truly maneuvered themselves into a tar pit with no escape. And yet, that still didn't really check out, did it? As they hovered there in the middle of that ball of death, the recently arrived ships themselves had, in turn, taken up their own semi-spherical position, guarding each other's backs as they faced the overwhelming odds they had brought against themselves. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but those are Zodiatos ships, aren't they?" she then wondered aloud, once she had taken a moment to really look at the visuals reaching her eyeballs there. The ships that had arrived were rather large. Of course, they had to be for such massive occupants. Their exterior was painted into a similar mossy grey-green as the Proboscidea themselves tended to sport. Though otherwise, they just looked like normal ships. Much unlike the human murder machine she found herself in the company of, those attackers certainly didn't sport the look of something that was simply barged into a defensive formation and expect to come out on top. However, exactly the fact that those things didn't look especially dangerous made the feline all the more worried. Also, what was the Dietos doing here in such a manner anyway? Weren't they one of the Qoiveri's closest allies? Still, all they could do was wait and see what happened. Or maybe what had already happened, given the delay that was between the actual action and any sort of perceptible signal reaching their current position. Maybe negotiations were actually still... Jirinora grimaced, as she couldn't even finish that thought before she saw one of the Zodaitos ships taking a shot at one of the Qoiveri cruisers. The fight had already begun. Looking into the past, Jirinora saw the cruiser quickly react to the shot, as it did its best to evade the projectile coming its way at relativistic speeds. Of course, relativistic in this case only meant as much as worthy to be mentioned in the same sentence as light speed, without actually coming all that close to it. However, there was still plenty fast to be extremely hard to avoid. As the Stark-White Qoiveri cruiser tilted its axis out of the projectile's path, a large gash was still ripped into the armor of the ship, and Jirinora didn't need any confirmation to see that the hull had been breached. That meant decompression. That meant the crew of at least one entire section of that ship was now dead. Inside, she felt a brief sting for the lives that were just lost. However, the feeling didn't quite manage to fully dominate her mind, as another thought overwhelmed it entirely. One shot? They fired one shot? Just what the hell is going on? Was all that she could really think. Who the hell was surrounded and fighting back-to-back with their allies, and fired one single shot? Was it just spite? That was the only explanation she could come up with. But even then, if they wanted to go out with a bang, wouldn't they at least all fire? Travel-sized hyperspace generation detected, the ever-vigilant ensign suddenly called out, noticing the sudden emergence of signals before Jirinora did, as her eyes were affixed to the ongoing battle. Multiple signals. 10, 20. He paused briefly in his futile attempt to call up the number of signals, as the signals reported by their systems are more alike to a frequency than any sort of constant value, as they rose and dropped by sometimes multiple tens at a time each second, giving no clear indication just how many ships were actually in motion. Jirionora's eyes darted from the heavily fluctuating number back to the visuals in pure confusion. Hyperspace! Why were hyperspace stretches? Her eyes widened and her breathing stopped in her throat, as her gaze fell upon the strange spectacle that had by now already occurred multiple moments ago, but was only now becoming visible to her and her crew. Obviously, the Qoiveri had not taken the attack on one of their ships lying down, and, after briefly moving to close their formation even further, had fired their own volleys of projectiles at the still unexplained Zodaitos. Unlike their opponents, what they fired was far from a single shot, as an absolute rain of projectiles closed in on the ships trapped in the middle of the formation, at speeds that were hard to comprehend for a mortal mind. Of course, the Qoiveri ships were positioned in such a way that none of them would be in the trajectory of one of their allies' cannons in their current formation. However, with the sheer volume of shots being fired, Jirionora couldn't deny that she felt a certain worry about accidental friendly fire occurring despite that. Ricochet was a thing, after all. However, what she actually saw with her own eyes a moment later was far, far worse than simple friendly fire, and it stunned her to her very core, because what she saw there at that moment is simply defied explanation. As the shots were already heading towards them to tear their ships to absolute shreds, the muddy green Zodaitos made no motion to even try to evade the projectiles. No, instead they seemed to take shots of their own, firing back at the overwhelming force of the Qoiveri. Another act of spite. It had to be, Jirionora thought. Simple defiance before the end would come. She could think of nothing else that it might be, and yet... After they had been fired, the shots from the Zodaitos' ships flew without anything strange happening for around 500 measures, behaving just like any other projectile would until suddenly... Jirionora's eyes widened and her pupils constricted to pinpricks, as they had to witness how the very fundamentals of what she thought she knew about warfare in space, and the technology involved, suddenly challenged. After they had reached that certain safety distance from their origin, the projectile suddenly activated. That was all she could call it, really. With a burst of light, the things suddenly illuminated the space around them, leaving them as hazy, barely perceptible spheres. For a second, Giovanora thought that those must have been the hyperspaces that they had picked up on, but that assumption quickly turned out to be so very false as the light of the projectile slowly started to extend around it. Like a balloon slowly growing as you blew more and more air inside of it, the strange light began to stretch out into growing spheres around the projectiles as they hurled through the void. The expansion was so quick that, soon enough, the entire group of invading ships was entirely enclosed by the enormous spheres of strange hazy light. The rain of shells fired by the Quaverie crashed against this newly created, well, the best word that Giovanora could find for it was shield. And to her utter horror, she now witnessed how the torrent of projectiles simply seemed to fizzle against this alien barrier, going up in sparks of light that didn't seem to leave as much as a scratch on the mind-boggling phenomenon before her. Meanwhile, the shield itself kept growing for just a bit longer, before its expansion suddenly ceased, as the spheres had presumably reached their maximum size. By now, they were larger than some of the ships attacking them. And just because their expansion had ceased, that by no means meant that their movement had also come to a halt. Separating from their briefly unified state again, the massive balls of hazy who knew what the hell it was kept flying in the direction of the Quaverie's surrounding sphere formation. Obviously, the local defense ships had already made moves to avoid the incoming projectiles from the moment they had been fired. However, those projectiles now suddenly were 1,000 times larger than they had originally been when the evasive maneuvers had begun. No amount of adjustment was going to make a difference now. With terror taking a tight grip of her blood, all Giovanora could do was to bear witness as the hazy glows of destruction moved towards the white ships in what felt like slow motion, their inevitable strike becoming a clear and long time before it actually occurred. The worst thing was that, in the back of her mind, she knew that what she saw was only a replay of the events. In reality, they had long hit their mark. For a moment, the feline commander almost wanted to look away. However, she knew that she couldn't. She couldn't avert her eyes from this historical event. Because she knew it. Like so many times in history, an entirely new kind of warfare had emerged yet again. And as though so often did, it had decided to announce itself with a spectacle. So, her eyes remained glued to the events that were unfolding, as the first hazy spheres finally made contact with the ships they had been aimed at. 6 shots, 11 kills. It would have been 12 had one of the shots not seemingly been slightly off-center, missing just enough of the smaller of the 2 ships it had hurled towards to leave most of its bow half intact. All the other ones, however. Whatever that hazy phenomenon was, it seemed to be packing an overwhelming amount of sheer force as it crashed against the ship's armor, denting it out of shape upon the first minuscule contact. And as if that wasn't horrifying enough, blunt force didn't seem to be all it brought to the table. Just like the projectiles that had fizzled against the haze earlier, the armor that came into contact with it so quickly began to glow, bubble, and melt that the only thing Giovanora's mind could equate the heat that must have been emitting from it at that moment to was the burning plasma of a star. The Quaverie ship stood absolutely no chance. Battered and broken and melted and beaten. The remains of the 11 ships in the sphere's paths now floated through space as nothing but dead scrap that was fit only to serve as a graveyard for their former crews after the spheres had passed them. Giovanora's eyes shot as wide open as they could, and her gaze immediately snapped around a bit as she realized the destructive path of the attack had not ended with that first hit, and her eyes soon fell onto the pitch-black outline of her more closely allied ships that had decided to remain close to the proceedings. Were they still in range? As her eyes darted from one ship to the next, she could feel every hair on her body stand up, as she realized with horror that the massive "A Place in the Sun" indeed found itself in the path of one of the spheres, with only mere moments before time to react to it than the Quaverie had at its current distance. And so far, it didn't look like the massive flagship had made even the tiniest movement to evade the shot. With her claws digging into the armrest of her seat, and her tail swaying as if it tried to batter her chair down, she stared wide-eyed as the hazy orb approached the sun, hundreds of measures at a time. Then, her intense focus turned out to be a big mistake, as suddenly, a flash of light of incredible brightness blinded her, stinging right into her eyes, as one of the hyperspace stretches they had already detected long before this moment opened up, swallowing the sun and moving the massive ship out of harm's way at a near instant. She quickly averted her gaze and painfully rubbed her eyes, doing her best to blink away the effects of what was basically a flashbang that had burned into her retinas. After a few moments of painful concentration, she managed to get enough of the opaque orbs floating around in her vision to recede, so that she could frantically glance up at the screen with her sensor readings again. She had seen one stretch there. So what was happening now that still made the number of signals look like someone was trying to draw a sign graph with their values? With a deep bellow escaping from his chest, all four of Konglorch's fiery eyes were dead focused on the sudden thing he was seeing in front of him. Mere moments ago, thunder-like sounds of explosions had erupted all throughout this facility that he had found himself locked up in for a long while, and not a few seconds later, the air itself seemed to have suddenly become, well, he couldn't quite describe it. As much as the tenacious sight strained his eyes, he couldn't make heads or tails of what he saw. A strange haze seemed to have spread throughout the facility, moving so quickly that its spread was basically impossible to follow before it already arrived in his close proximity, stopping just before it came dangerously close. What was it? He had no idea. There was no visual indication. It was just a haze, almost as if an incredibly hot fire was burning just underneath it, distorting the air. He inhaled deeply through his nose. There was no smell to it. Now that the loud thundering was over, it also seemed to make no sound, or at least no sound loud enough to be audible over the ringing in the Lizardor's ears. After the strange haze had approached them, he was using his tail to hold back Moore, who was seen to have gotten quite the fright at the sudden eruption of noise. He didn't know if the old lady had any desire to try and approach this strange phenomenon. However, he wasn't going to take chances. Suddenly, there was a piercing shriek somewhere nearby. It was hard to tell where. The sound seemed to only come through the walls of the building itself, instead travelling louder through the hallways like one would expect. Konglorch's eyes narrowed at the strange haze even more. Was it blocking sound somehow? Either way, muffled as it was, he knew that voice. And if Admiral Krieger was shrieking in pain, then there truly must have been trouble. Still holding the Raphaelite back from doing the same with his long tail, the Tenaciousite began to slowly approach the strange haze, careful to keep his momentum and all of his limbs in check. Once he was within reach, the armored titan then released another low bellow, contemplating for a moment longer before slowly and carefully reaching out one of his claws in the direction of the haze. He only touched it with the very tip of the claw, which was supposed to be nothing but dead keratin. Yet still, he had to jolt his hand back instantly as a burning pain shot through his entire arm, as if a white-hot needle were being rammed straight through its entire length instantly. As one of his eyes shot to look down at his hand, the tip of his claw was gone, leaving nothing but a flattened, scorch-mark-riddled stump behind. Releasing a deep hiss, and very glad that he had not tried to touch it with any more important part of his body, Konglorch quickly retreated from the haze again, deciding not to mess with whatever this was. "What in goodness' name?" Moore mumbled, as she too stared at the unexplainable occurrence. It didn't seem like, in all her years, she had ever seen anything even remotely like it, and Konglorch could not claim any more experience of his own on that front. This was something new, something alien. "What do we do?" Moore quickly snapped her attention around, looking at Konglorch directly with wide-open eyes. Immediately, her claw began to nervously comb through her fur as she spoke. "Admiral Krieger sounded like she was in deep peril." Konglorch could only grunt for his long teeth. "What can we do?" he wondered, both aloud and to himself. Whatever this was, there seemed to be no getting through it. They were lucky they hadn't got caught in the path of his expansion. "I don't think—" His word was cut off as suddenly the haze just vanished before his very eyes, disappeared like it had never been there in the first place. Well, though as if one ignored the path of destruction it had left. Conglorch's mouth remained hanging open for a long moment. Was it over? His question was answered when suddenly the sound of a new explosion echoed through the halls. However, this one sounded a lot more traditional than the ones he had heard before the haze had so suddenly begun to spread. To him, it sounded like a breaching charge. It seemed like someone had decided to grant themselves entrance. This probably wasn't over.